Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, it's a privilege for me to be here with you today. Thank you all for making the time to come out for this briefing. I want to thank you also to the EPC for having invited me here to speak on behalf of a small community of 32,000 people, which is often overlooked in the wider discussions. I know that the work that you do here in the EPC and the debate that you generate make an important contribution to political life here in the heart of the European Union. So, Brexit's other land border, Gibraltar and the future of the UK-EU relationship. You will know there are technically 3 Brexit land borders which the UK is ultimately responsible for. These are the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, the border between the Republic of Cyprus and the UK sovereign bases on the island, and the border between Gibraltar and Spain. There are also sea borders, not least, for example, the UK overseas territory of Anguilla, where they worry about the connection by sea to Dutch and French islands in the region. The reality is that the UK government in these negotiations, as it did in the withdrawal process, represents a wide variety of territories, each with their own governments and with their own peculiarities and interests. The 3 devolved administrations, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, the Crown dependencies, Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man, and the overseas territories. This includes Anguilla, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, the Falkland Islands, Montserrat, Picton, St. Helena, and the Turks and Caicos. And among the latter, of course, is Gibraltar, the only territory that was actually part of the EU, and therefore the only one that has now left the club. This happened only 17 days ago, when the EU-UK withdrawal agreement came into effect. It settled what was perhaps the most controversial and messy divorce in British history, with all due respect to Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. In fact, I am conscious of the fact that this is the first time that a Gibraltar minister addresses the EU bubble with Gibraltar as a third country. An accolade, believe me, I would rather not have had. 7 years on from David Cameron's infamous Bloomberg speech, who would have predicted the events which have led us here to where we are today? But as Cameron himself said in that speech, you will not always get what you want. That statement is truer with respect to Gibraltar than it is with respect to any constituency in the UK which voted in the referendum. On the 23rd of June 2016, 95.91% of those who cast their vote in Gibraltar voted to remain. Not even here, in the heart of the European Quarter in Brussels, would you get such a result. Not even perhaps if I asked for a show of hands here now, in this room, would the EU enjoy such an overwhelming degree of support. Yet 47 years of EU membership, and despite our emphatic support for the preservation of our relationship with the European Union, we have accompanied the UK as it left political Europe. We chose to be pragmatic. We chose to get on with the job of protecting the interests of Gibraltar as we left. And as we move forward into the future, I submit that in those discussions to come, Gibraltar should not be the victim of Brexit. The people of Gibraltar, the people that I represent, do not deserve that. As we reflect on Gibraltar's history in the EU, perhaps it is right for me to start at the very beginning, to turn the clock back in time and recall what Gibraltar was like when it joined the European Economic Community on the 1st of January 1973. It is difficult to imagine this, but as a child growing up in Gibraltar, I did so confined to a territory of less than 6 square kilometers, roughly the size of Ixelles. Gibraltar was effectively isolated from mainland Europe, because on the 8th of June 1969, just over 50 years ago, terrestrial links between Gibraltar and Spain were cut off completely, by the then dictator, General Franco. The border we are discussing today was physically shut. Sea links with Spain were stopped too. Telephone communications were terminated. Gibraltar became, to all intents and purposes, a city under siege. Life was not easy. Times were hard. Families on both sides of the border were torn apart. Lifelong friends were separated. Thousands of Spanish citizens who worked in Gibraltar could no longer access their jobs. Many of them chose to emigrate to the UK or to Germany. No tourists would come in by land either. The blockade was absolute. In fact, Franco predicted that Gibraltar would fall like a ripe fruit. It was a prediction that never materialized. The people of Gibraltar faced up to the dictator and endured nearly 16 years locked up in a few square kilometers. I provide this snapshot because it is important to understand how the operation and closure of that border at that time had a devastating effect on everything around it. This cannot be allowed to happen again. It was against this backdrop that Gibraltar joined the then EEC alongside the UK, with a sense of optimism and positivity. Without Spain in the club, the UK was free to negotiate a tailor-made arrangement for Gibraltar. This took account of Gibraltar's geographical features and the fact that at the time, cut off from Spain and from Europe, most of its goods came from Morocco, the nearest neighboring third country. Flexibility and pragmatism ruled the day. With creativity, imagination, and a dash of good faith, essential, technical, tailor-made solutions for Gibraltar were agreed with respect to certain areas. That same creativity, imagination, and good faith is what is required today. So what were those arrangements? In accordance with what was then Article 2274 of the Treaty of Rome, the EU treaties were applied to Gibraltar as a European territory for whose external relations a member state was or is responsible. In our case, a member state is the United Kingdom. Gibraltar remained outside the common agricultural policy and the common fisheries policy. We have no agriculture and we have no fishing industry. Gibraltar was left out of the customs union and outside the scope of EU rules on indirect taxes, such as VAT and excise duty. This was perfectly logical. The closed border meant that Gibraltar was physically cut off from the EEC. And in any case, back then, political Europe started in the Pyrenees, because Spain and Portugal were not yet members. This tailor-made solution allowed Gibraltar to freely import goods, as I said, mainly from Morocco, and feed and sustain its population. Consequently, the rules on the free movement of goods do not apply to Gibraltar either, and Gibraltar does not form part of the common commercial policy insofar as trade in goods are concerned. It is because of these arrangements that import-export procedures between Gibraltar and the EU have always been carried out as if Gibraltar was a third country. There have always been customs control in force at the land border between Gibraltar and Spain. This is partly where the similarities between our border and, in keeping with the title of the discussion, Brexit's other land border end. And it serves to clarify that whereas the debate in the context of Northern Ireland has been primarily about the movement of goods, the debate in Gibraltar is essentially about the movement of persons. The issue in Gibraltar is not controls and checkpoints. These already exist. The issue is how the EU or Spain will exercise such controls at the end of the transition. But more about the border later on. Turning back to Gibraltar's EU status, it is important to understand that in all other parts of the acquis, all were applied to Gibraltar in full. The obvious exception was those areas where the UK itself secured an exclusion for itself. EU goods on freedom of movement of establishment, freedom of movement of capital, the freedom to provide services, and freedom of movement of persons are all observed and enjoyed in Gibraltar. And this will continue during the transition until the end of the year. Those rules are applied and enforced in Gibraltar as if Gibraltar were a member state in its own right. In keeping with our constitution, legislation passed by the Gibraltar Parliament transposes EU law into Gibraltar's legal order, wholly separately and independently from what may be done in Westminster for the United Kingdom. The UK only retains responsibility for Gibraltar's defence, internal security and external affairs, with an important carve-out. This says that matters which are the responsibility of Gibraltar ministers do not cease to be so, even if they arise in the context of the European Union. So, although smaller both in size and in population, Gibraltar enjoys more autonomy than Scotland, Wales, or Northern Ireland. Indeed, probably more autonomy and more self-government than any region of Europe. This tailor-made status distinctively makes Gibraltar stand apart from any of the other British overseas territories and from the Crown dependencies. Gibraltar is uniquely the only member of the British family of nations outside the United Kingdom that enjoys such a deep and special relationship with the European Union. This is why Gibraltar was the only territory outside of the UK that voted in the referendum. Gibraltar's economy flourished as part of the single market and became the modern service-based economy that it is today. Curiously, the application of EU rules also helped to develop our trading relationship in services with the UK. Indeed, the United Kingdom remains the main market for financial services institutions based in Gibraltar. 1 in 4 cars in the UK, for example, are insured through Gibraltar companies. That access to the UK market has been guaranteed post-Brexit. In the event of no agreement between the UK and the EU, or even if there is an agreement, Gibraltar could well become the only part of continental Europe to enjoy frictionless market access into the United Kingdom. Moving on, I have to say a word that any account on the history of Gibraltar in the EU would not be complete without a mention of Spain. I should point out that our time in the EU was rather boring and uneventful up until 1986, when Spain joined the European Community. The most immediate positive effect of Spanish accession was that Spain had to fully reopen the land border as a prerequisite to joining. The rusty gates were unlocked and swung open in February 1985, 10 years after General Franco had passed away. They had been shut for close to 16 years. With the opening of the border, Gibraltar was once again able to regenerate its tourism industry. 10 million tourists are visitors to Gibraltar every year. They account for a quarter of our economy. Once the border opened, Gibraltar was once again able to offer jobs to thousands and thousands of citizens who live across the border in Spain. There were grounds for a real sense of positivity and hope with Spanish accession. The genuine expectation that a new page would now be turned, a new beginning. Sadly, this proved to be short-lived. It became clear almost at once that instead of allowing political differences to dissolve, some in Madrid saw the EEC as a means of advancing their sovereignty claim to Gibraltar. The people of Gibraltar, from the point of Spanish accession, have always felt hard done by the EU. 5 years ago, in this very forum, I spoke in detail about those issues. But today, I want to look forward. So what explains the 96% result in favour of continued membership? As President von der Leyen very recently put it, the relationship may not always have been smooth or perfect. What relationship ever is? But the good far outweighs the difficult. This point is well understood in Gibraltar. And at a time when the EU project was being seriously questioned, one would have thought that Brussels would have embraced the people of Gibraltar, who gave them a 96% vote of confidence. that they would have been more generous with Gibraltar. But sadly, there was no embrace, and there was also no generosity. In the event, what happened was almost the reverse. The people of Gibraltar had good reason to be worried in 2016. Threats were made. First, that once Gibraltar left the European Union, all options would be open to Spain, including closing the border again completely. Second, that any relationship between Gibraltar and the EU had to come through shared sovereignty with Spain. It is relevant to note that the very principle of shared sovereignty had already been rejected by 98% of the population in a referendum that took place in 2002. So the Brexit process did not get off to a good start. And the degree of obsession with Gibraltar at the time was considerable. Indeed, it was markedly different to what happens elsewhere. There are, as you know, a number of micro-states and territories in different parts of the European Union. Small countries like Andorra, Liechtenstein, San Marino, Monaco, and even the Vatican City. They are the product of their history and their own distinct political and constitutional evolution. All have found a modus vivendi with their large neighbours. And I call on the EU in general and Spain in particular as our nearest EU neighbour to find a modus vivendi with Gibraltar too. But we can't supply an 18th century solution in the 21st century. In the 18th century, kings and princes could hand over territories from one to another regardless of the wishes of their inhabitants. Those days ended a very long time ago. Today, people come first. The politics of conflict and confrontation must give way to dialogue and cooperation. It is important to recall that as the exit process started, the EU, pressured by Spain, unnecessarily singled out Gibraltar for special treatment, apart from the rest. This came at the first available opportunity after the UK dispatched its notification to initiate the Article 50 process. Clause 24 of the Council's negotiating guidelines for the withdrawal negotiations, published on the 29th of April 2017, stated as follows. After the United Kingdom leaves the Union, no agreement between the EU and the UK may apply to the territory of Gibraltar without the agreement between the Kingdom of Spain and the United Kingdom. For staunch supporters of Gibraltar of the European project and the passionate believers of the principles enshrined in the EU treaties, myself included, this was a bitter pill to swallow. At first it was thought that the words "after the United Kingdom leaves the Union" would have meant this veto would not apply to the withdrawal agreement. It would only apply to the future relationship. Indeed, even President Juncker thought the same. In answer to a European Parliament question on the 6th of July 2017, President Juncker stated that this additional veto, and I quote, does not relate to the withdrawal negotiations with the United Kingdom, but to the future relationship between the EU and the UK. But again, sadly, when it comes to Gibraltar, we have learned that anything goes. Despite what President Juncker had said, Gibraltar finally ended up in a negotiation for inclusion in the withdrawal treaty, and obviously in the transitional phase that went with it. But think about it, because it really does not make much sense. Why would anyone want to exclude Gibraltar from the withdrawal agreement? I mean, what does anybody stand to gain by that? Why would Spain want to deprive its own citizens from enjoying the benefits of the withdrawal agreement? What purpose would a no-deal Brexit have served at Spain's only land border with a UK territory? There is no logical explanation. But in the midst of this negotiation, the view of Spain then was the dominant voice in Brussels. Inexplicably, after this, Gibraltar was expressly excluded by name from the EU's no-deal contingency planning measures, as if businesses and citizens in this small corner of Europe somehow didn't matter. Let me ask once more, what did anybody stand to gain by the exclusion of Gibraltar from the EU's no-deal planning measures? even in the measure on visa-free travel, where Gibraltar was actually included, an awkward, inflammatory footnote was added, bluntly referring to Gibraltar as a colony. The term added absolutely nothing to the legal value of the operative part of the regulation. So why put it there? And this move came after the European Parliament's rapporteur, who was supported by his co-rapporteurs in opposing that text, was, in an unprecedented move, forcibly removed from his position. This, in my view, completely undermined the co-decision procedure and placed a huge question mark over the Parliament's powers in decision-making. The underlying attitude to which many represented no more than the bullying of a tiny territory by a huge supranational organization, and this did nothing to build confidence, trust, or goodwill. Nonetheless, Gibraltar was, as I said, included in the territorial scope of the withdrawal agreement. And this came after the first direct engagement between Gibraltar and Spain for many years, while Spain's Partido Popular was still in office. Such an engagement was part of a variable geometry of negotiations and discussions, which also included the United Kingdom and the European Union in 2, 3, or 4-sided talks. This led to the negotiation of the Gibraltar Protocol to the withdrawal agreement. There is one protocol for each border, as you know, one for Northern Ireland, one for Cyprus, and one for Gibraltar. 4 memoranda of understanding were also negotiated between Gibraltar and Spain. These dealt with practical arrangements of a local nature concerning the environment, police and customs cooperation, citizens' rights, and excisable goods. A tax treaty completed the package. This was also negotiated between Gibraltar and Spain. It was signed by the United Kingdom in respect of Gibraltar as a state responsible for Gibraltar's international relations. That package secured Gibraltar's orderly exit from the European Union. Moving forward now, the future negotiations have started in the same way as the exit negotiations had begun. You will be aware that the EU, at Spain's behest, has stated that any agreement with the United Kingdom on the basis of the draft negotiating directives published earlier this month will not include Gibraltar. Not that there will not be an agreement, but that it will not be on the basis of this mandate. Instead, the UK government has made it abundantly clear on repeated occasions that it will negotiate the future agreements implementing the joint political declaration, also on behalf of Gibraltar. So whatever form an agreement may take, it is obvious that a discussion of the future relationship between Gibraltar and the European Union will involve Spain as our nearest EU neighbour. It is also clear that depending on the shape any agreement or agreements take, all member states will effectively have the power to veto anything anywhere that they do not like. Gibraltar too has the power to walk away. This in effect brings me to where we are now, to the pertinent issue facing Gibraltar today, this being its future relationship with the European Union. But before turning to content, I want to briefly turn to approach. And by that I mean how Madrid may focus this issue. There are those there who say that Spain must capitalize on the apparently historic opportunity that she now has to recover sovereignty over Gibraltar after 300 years. In other words, the medieval approach I described earlier, an approach which tramples over the rights of the Gibraltarians to determine their own political future, an approach which puts flags and nationalism first, an approach where citizens, workers, businesses, and neighbourly relations are mere afterthoughts which can be sacrificed, an approach that clearly will get us nowhere. There is, of course, a different way of doing things, a door that can be opened with mutual respect. It is significant that the current centre-left socialist Prime Minister, Pedro Sánchez, has called himself for a different approach, one which puts a historic, perennial sovereignty question to one side and focuses instead on the opportunity we now have to create an area of shared prosperity on both sides of the border. And Spain's new Foreign Minister, Arantxa González Laya, has echoed this too. Speaking very recently, she said, and I quote, that for citizens, a discussion on sovereignty is all very well and good, but what they really care about is whether they will be able to cross the border. She continued to say that Spain would be doing a disservice to its own citizens if at the end of this process their day-to-day issues are not resolved. Look, we will not agree on everything, but it is a pragmatism, this pragmatism, that creates the space in which we can talk. As I said, the single main issue for Gibraltar in relation to a future outside the European Union is the land border with Spain. The manner in which persons and goods cross a border after the 31st of December 2020 is vital to increasing the level of shared prosperity that exists today. The border is a vital artery. It needs to remain unclogged. It is a pillar on which rests the economic interplay between communities on both sides. It is also the conduit which allows social, cultural, and human interaction to take place. As at the end of December last year, Gibraltar employed 14,464 frontier workers. There were 6,400 in 2012, 14,400 now. This means 8,000 new jobs have been created for frontier workers since 2012, an increase of 120%. These are people who reside in Spain, but who work in Gibraltar. 14,464 persons may not sound like much in the general scheme of things, but they make up over 40% of the workforce in Gibraltar. And when taken as a whole, it makes Gibraltar the second largest employer in the entire region of Andalusia, second only to its regional government. These workers are employed in different areas of the economy, in financial services, in catering, social services, health services, hotels, restaurants, retail. There is virtually zero unemployment in Gibraltar. In sharp contrast, unemployment in the surrounding region of Spain was acutely hit by the 2008 economic crisis. This oscillates at alarming rates of around 30% and is even higher amongst young people. That is why Spanish politicians on the other side of the border, Spanish pressure groups, Spanish trade unions, business associations, and other stakeholders are all calling for fluidity at the border to be maintained as well. The bulk of frontier workers are made up of 9,320 Spanish citizens. 2,296 are UK nationals. However, some of you may be surprised to learn that every single member state of the European Union has frontier workers employed in Gibraltar. So, for example, we have 831 Portuguese, 424 Romanians, 193 Poles, 125 Germans, and even 2 from Luxembourg. This makes Gibraltar a microcosm of what the EU is all about. Citizens living on one side of a border and working freely on the other side. And this cannot be lost going forward. The border is not only important in the context of frontier workers, but also in the context of tourism, a mainstay of the Gibraltar economy. Millions of tourists visit Gibraltar each year through the land border. This sector generates some 2,000 jobs, many of which are occupied by frontier workers. Therefore, any border restriction which adversely affects tourists would have a knock-on effect on workers. It is all interconnected. The latest figures published by the Spanish Ministry for Commerce show that Spain exported goods valued at 1.5 billion euros to Gibraltar in 1 year. The figures show that Gibraltar is the largest export market for the province of Cadiz next door. That Cadiz sells more to Gibraltar than it does to France or to the United Kingdom. The positive economic impact from residents of Gibraltar in the surrounding area should not be underestimated either. Residents of Gibraltar spend over 80 million euros a year purchasing goods and services in Andalusia, in shops, in restaurants, in hotels, and elsewhere. It is relevant to recall that during a time of lengthy border delays in 2015, residents of Gibraltar unilaterally decided to stay at home instead of queuing up for hours to cross into Spain. This led to complaints from Spanish business organizations to their own government, who claimed that 40% of trade had been lost in revenue as a result of trade of persons from Gibraltar not crossing into Spain. There is also the important factor of human relations, family links, friendships, sports and cultural exchanges. Therefore, the message is simple. Border fluidity for everyone equals greater prosperity for everyone. Residents, workers, and tourists. This is not a matter of political opinion. It is a matter of simple economics. Indeed, Spain's new foreign minister made precisely this point in a constructive tone to the Financial Times only last week. The Gibraltar population needs the Spaniards to function, she said, and the Spaniards need the Gibraltarians in order to enhance their prosperity. We welcome the existing level of shared prosperity, and we want to generate even more. Therefore, a pragmatic, well-balanced and sensible solution to the border is as much in the interest of the neighbouring region of Spain and the EU as it is in the interests of Gibraltar. So finally, what are the solutions then? First of all, I think it's important to state that a solution for the border between Gibraltar and Spain would have zero impact on the United Kingdom itself. There are already customs controls and immigration controls between Gibraltar and the United Kingdom. This means that the land border between Gibraltar and Spain would not become a soft underbelly for those wanting to illegally enter the Schengen area or the UK. And the UK government itself has always supported arrangements at the border between Gibraltar and Spain which promote fluidity and shared prosperity in the region. So if the political will is there on the EU sides, legal solutions will follow. It is the politics that drives the law and not the other way around. One possibility is that of a common travel area between Gibraltar and the European Union. Indeed, for those listening carefully 5 years ago, I mentioned this possibility then in this very forum. Being outside the EU, as you know, is not a bar to fluid access across EU borders. Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Iceland are all examples of non-EU Schengen states. Monaco, San Marino, Andorra also benefit from border facilitated arrangements with the European Union. If the frictionless border processes are what we want, there is no need to reinvent the wheel. The solution already exists. And there are other potential solutions in EU law also. Therefore, the message from the government of Gibraltar is that we need to be ambitious. We need to genuinely seize the moment to obliterate the politics of the past. But in the mindset, we must move away from the negative to the positive, away from talk of vetoes and talk of exclusions, because citizens want to hear solutions and not threats. Because the 1st of January 2021 is just around the corner for the person who relies on the border to feed the family, for the company whose business in Spain is dependent on customers from Gibraltar, for the many entities that now earn millions of euros exporting to Gibraltar, for residents on both sides of the border, for those with family and friends on the other side, and for those genuinely concerned about the future. And it is only with a future agreement that is good for Gibraltar that those concerns will be allayed. Because what is good for Gibraltar is good for the surrounding region. We are at a historic moment, and whilst the challenges are great, so too are the opportunities. So let me repeat what I said earlier. Border fluidity for all equals shared prosperity for all. That is the message I want to leave you with today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Deputy Chief Minister, for that comprehensive